And so you may notice you have to accept that you still want to participate with the recording. So we'll give you a moment to do so. Okay, so thank you and welcome to the Cabrillo College Educational Panel on Ukraine. We're so honored that you have chosen to spend your evening with us, learning more about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Tonight's panel will host a variety of faculty and staff who are going to be sharing from their areas of expertise and their personal experiences. And in tonight's audience, we are privileged to host students, staff, faculty, trustees, alumni of the college, and some of our community members. So thank you. We are eager to get started with this event. However, we also want to take a moment just to cover some basic Zoom etiquette so that we can ensure the best possible experience for everyone who's participating. So we ask that you please remain muted while panelists are sharing. You can locate this button at the bottom of your screen. This is not only out of respect to the people who have contributed their time and chosen to present, but also to your fellow attendees so that we can clearly hear everything that's being shared tonight. And additionally, since this is being recorded, if you would like to have your video on or off, that is at your discretion, and you can use the button at the bottom. The chat feature at the bottom is a great way to reach out to us if you have a question or something that you want to check in about. Also, this will be the way that we are running our Q&A opportunities for this evening. If we do feel that you are not here in the spirit of wanting to learn more for this event, or not following some of these Zoom etiquette, distracting, or in some way deterring from the overall panel, we may remove you from this meeting. However, it will be recorded, so you'll be able to see everything that was addressed if that's the case. We also want to share a little bit about what has brought us here and what has culminated to create this event. So, it's been 2 months since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it has escalated the ongoing conflict in that region. Although this might feel like a new event for some of us, this is actually something that has been happening, ongoing since 2014 and during the Cold War. And we're going to learn a little bit more about the history and context contributing to that from some of tonight's speakers. Additionally, in late 2021, Putin began assembling military equipment and soldiers on the borders of Ukraine. And on the 24th, Putin announced what he called a special military operation. However, his goal was framed as to denazify Ukraine, which is led by Jewish President Volodymyr Zelensky, and to demilitarize Ukraine. So one of tonight's panelists specifically will be sharing a little bit more about the theories and things that have contributed to this event and this invasion as well. The invasion has been harrowing, and Russia's invasion has not gone as planned, but has still been very tragic. Ukraine's resistance has been challenging to Russia, but has not come without cost. Although the death toll is hard to pin down specifically due to limited access from outside regions and in areas under siege, it is estimated that over 15,000 souls have been lost in this conflict already, and almost 3 million or more Ukrainians have been fleeing the country. This invasion has created the largest refugee crisis since World War II, and one of our panelists is going to be sharing a little bit about how neighboring Poland has become the epicenter for this refugee and mass migration crisis. Even though Ukraine is over 6,000 miles away, the impacts can still be felt here at home in Santa Cruz County, and even more specifically at Cabrillo College. Aside from the impacts on inflation, which one of our panelists will address a little bit, some Cabrillo College faculty and staff have actually gone on the ground in Ukraine to support those efforts. Additionally, we have study abroad students here at Cabrillo from Ukraine as well, and some of our panelists will share a little bit about the ways that study abroad students are impacted during these times of chaos. Additionally, many community members in our greater Santa Cruz area hold close ties as well. Some people have friends and loved ones, worry for their homeland, and even people who don't have an immediate connection have been showing their hopes for peace by flying Ukrainian flags or having sunflowers on their porch, the flower of Ukraine. One of Santa Cruz's sister cities is Alusha, Ukraine, and some of us locally have been considering what this connection means and how we can best support our sister city during this time of crisis. When we began planning this event, we had a host of potential speakers and ideas in mind, but what was really impactful in this process of creating this panel was how many of our esteemed faculty and staff said that they too just wanted to learn more themselves rather than to share. And these conversations made it evident that this crisis carries such an immense weight, and we're really honored just to have our speakers here tonight. The diversity of all of you in the audience shows that this event is connected to so many of us in different ways, and we're glad that you've chosen to be here. Tonight's panel is created by Cabrillo College faculty and staff, sharing from either their own areas of expertise, their research, or experiences in life, and sometimes a little bit of both. We hope that this provides some unique insight into the conflict and shares some of the different perspectives that you might not find in mass media. Additionally, we know that there is a heavy mental health weight of wartime, invasion, and all of these things. For our Cabrillo College staff and faculty, Student Health Services is going to be hosting their third day of the Cabrillo College Student Mental Health Conference tomorrow, called Healing Together, from 9 to 12:30. It will be live on Zoom. We invite you to attend and also to consider reaching out to them directly if you're feeling immense distress from these activities. There's also a bunch of community options that we're happy to direct you to if you're not currently associated with the college. As you listen tonight, we ask that you maybe consider taking notes or jotting down questions as they arise for you. We are hoping, time permitting, to host a short Q&A, and if we cannot get to all of those questions, we will do so by addressing them in the resources list that we have shared with some of you already via email, and also it can be found on our website, and we'll be sure to drop a link to that in the chat as well. This is our timeline of tonight's panel. So we will begin this evening with Dr. Matt Wettstein, Dr. Nick Rowell, and Dr. Jamila Yukadeva, who will all share from a political science perspective. Then we will transition to Motoko Nakazawa-Hewitt and Anna Zagorska, who will elucidate an international student perspective during times of crisis. Evelina Bieranowska will share insight from the burgeoning refugee crisis and the connections between Poland and Ukraine. And lastly, Dusty McKenzie will talk a little bit more about the connections to American youth from past and present. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we are excited to be able to host Dr. Matt Wettstein as our first speaker this evening. Dr. Wettstein is the president of Cabrillo College. He earned his doctoral degree in political science from Northern Illinois University and his master's degree, which focused on international relations and Soviet foreign policy. Matt's research work during his master's program was focused on empirical analyses of the nuclear arms race, as well as arms control agreements between the Soviet Union and the US. Tonight, Matt will share a little bit about the geopolitical forces that are flowing from Putin and the invasion of Ukraine. He will address the connection between the war, food insecurity, global and inflationary price pressures on food commodities. So we are honored to welcome Dr. Matt Wettstein as our first speaker for this evening. Thank you, Matt.
It looks like, is Matt missing from the participants? Kendall, he was just here a minute ago.
Thank you. He was just here. I'm not exactly sure where he went. Yeah, we'll give him a moment. So while we await Matt's hopeful resume in a moment, a question did come up of will this be posted in the website in case we would like to share it with someone, and the answer is yes. And I'm wondering if maybe we should transition to Nick to give Matt a moment to rejoin us.
Yeah, that'd be fine with me. Why don't we do that?
Okay, well, let me go ahead and introduce Nick Rowell instead first. So Nick will be, sorry, I'm lost in my notes now. So Nick earned his PhD in political science from the University of New Mexico in 2012. He has taught US government, comparative politics, and international relations at Cabrillo College since 2014. His research background focuses on comparative analysis of developing countries with an emphasis My gosh, I'm so sorry. I got lost in my notes. One moment. With an emphasis, drum roll, on American politics, especially interactions between civil society and the state. His teaching emphasizes the robust civic engagement required to sustain the health of democracies. Tonight, Nick will focus on the rapid, large-scale, and tumultuous changes in Ukraine's domestic politics over the past decade. So we are excited to welcome Nick Rowell as our first speaker for this evening.
Great. Thank you so much, Kendall. And thank you all so much for attending this evening. I'm eager to have the opportunity to kick us off now. So as Kendall sort of just said in her introduction for me, there are two things I kind of want to try to connect. The first is that my plan for my time tonight is to talk a little bit about the domestic politics of Ukraine. So what's been going on inside the country of Ukraine politically for roughly the last decade. The other thing that I wanted to sort of highlight from Kendall's introduction is that my own background and research expertise is not in Ukraine, it's in the politics of Latin America. And so there might be like a little bit of dissonance there. Like, why is a person who's a specialist in Latin American politics willing to play expert when it comes to a country like Ukraine? And what I wanted to share with you to kind of get us started is a sort of like, inside the political science community, this is not a secret, but maybe outside of the political science community, this is not well known. And it's that many experts in the politics of post-Soviet states have an enormous amount of research overlap with specialists in the politics of Latin America. And I wanted to share that in part because perhaps many folks in the audience feel a strong personal connection to countries in Latin America. And I wanted to point out that a lot of what Ukraine has been experiencing for the last decade has like echoes of the Latin American experience as well. And what I mean by that specifically is that when a country sort of transitioned, right, from from part of the Soviet Union to a post-Soviet state after 1991, that transition involved profound economic dislocation and suffering, a dramatic rise in inequality, and the creation of regimes that all hoped might be democratic, but regimes that then struggled to actually consolidate democracy, to make democracy a stable type of regime, a stable set of institutions. And with that comes a certain vulnerability to foreign pressure, meaning pressure from other countries, specifically other great powers. So for what many people in Ukraine may or may not be feeling today might echo feelings that many people had in Latin America during decades like the 1980s, but feelings directed towards the United States. So it's in that sense that this feels like a strong connection that maybe I have something valuable to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen to sort of get us started because I have a few images that I want to share to sort of help me talk through the recent history of Ukraine. Most of the images I'm going to show you tonight are maps with a little bit of data. And if I go too fast through those images and you want to look at them in closer detail, most of the images I'm going to share with you tonight are actually from an article created by the Brookings Institute that is freely available online. And I have added a link to our resource document to the source of those images. So if you can navigate to our resource link, which I think Kendall might be preparing to share in the chat box, you can take more time if you'd like with the images I'm about to show you. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And what I'm going to focus on is the extent to which Ukraine has overcome substantial challenges over the last decade to really double down on a sense of self-determination, to really achieve self-determination and make a sovereign decision to align itself closer with the West as opposed to Russia. One of the greatest tragedies of the war at present is Russia's efforts to usurp that movement on the part of Ukraine, that sovereign choice made by the people of Ukraine. So the domestic political context of that last decade or so looks something like this. Ukraine is a country that has profound, or has until the last few years at least, had a profound and overlapping series of what we call social cleavages. Another term for that might be something like political fault lines. In other words, the big demographic groups that tend to compete against each other inside the political system have certain identities that overlap, meaning the same people, regardless of identities, are often pushed into opposition with each other inside Ukraine's political system. One of the best proxies for that division within Ukrainian society is regional, in a sense of a distinction between Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine. Overlapping on top of that is people who live in Eastern Ukraine who may be more likely to identify in an ethnic sense as Russian, ethnically Russian. And layering on top of that is also people who live in Eastern Ukraine who are much more likely to identify Russian as their native language, as their quote unquote mother tongue. That is sharply different from what's more common in Western Ukraine, which has more ties to the West, where people are more likely to identify being Ukrainian as their most salient identity, and folks who are more likely to speak the language of Ukrainian. And so it's Ukraine in a geographic sense is a country very much sort of stuck between East and West. And that's reflected in the internal demographics and politics of Ukraine as well, East versus West. Now, up until the last decade or so, one of the sort of basic assumptions of many outside observers, but also participants inside Ukrainian politics, is that regional divide with all those other identity factors meant that Ukraine's politics was likely for the indefinite future to be an ongoing contest between East and West. Or what is the future of Ukraine? Is it a future that looks more like the European Union or builds closer ties to the European Union? Or is it a future that looks more and more like Russia and builds closer ties to Russia? One really stark example of why so many observers thought this would be the defining characteristic of Ukrainian politics moving forward is the results of the 2010 presidential election in Ukraine, which saw two very different candidates run for president. One of those candidates, Viktor Yanukovych, was a candidate who ran a campaign that was explicitly pro-Russia. In other words, he was envisioning a future for Ukraine that was much, much more oriented towards the East. His main opposition in that election was Yulia Tymoshenko. Her vision of Ukraine that she articulated in this election was much, much more pro-West, pro-democracy, and building of ties to the European Union. Now, the results of this election are summarized in this map, and what you can see is that the areas shaded in blue are the countries where the provinces within Ukraine that voted at a higher rate for Yanukovych. In other words, the more pro-Russia candidate. When all votes nationwide were tallied in this election, which was recognized by international observers as free and fair, Yanukovych was the victor. So in other words, the pro-Russia candidate became the new president of Ukraine after 2010. It is then in this space from 2010 until 2014 that Ukraine begins to undergo a profound transition. And 2014 will be a before and after moment in the history of Ukraine, analogous to how maybe some people in the United States see 1968 in the United States, or analogous to the way many people see Mexican politics in terms of the year 1994. There's before and there's after. So the 2010 election delivers Yanukovych to office. Yanukovych then is embroiled in what had become at this point a pretty typical struggle inside Ukrainian political institutions. Ukraine uses a type of democracy called a semi-presidential system. This is not at all a rare type of democracy. This is in fact analogous to the type of democracy used in France. But in a semi-presidential system, the people, voters, elect a president in one election, and then subsequently vote for local representatives to go represent them in a parliament. But then that parliament assumes responsibility for all domestic policy, and the president assumes responsibility for foreign policy and oversight of the military. In other words, what in the United States we might think of as two branches of government are actually given two profoundly different sets of powers over different parts of political life. So the pattern that emerges throughout early independent Ukraine history is that very often presidents would be elected, but then coalitions would form in the parliament that had profound disagreements relative to the president. In other words, they were articulating very different futures for Ukraine. This was very much the case after 2010. After 2010, there was increased support inside Ukraine's parliament for Ukraine to move more towards the European Union, to establish closer ties with that institution, to move towards the West. Yanukovych, on the other hand, had run for president successfully and won the office by articulating a much more pro-East, pro-Russia vision. But the tricky part here is that to join the European Union for a country like Ukraine or any other country involves not just international affairs decisions, not just foreign policy decisions that would be normally handled by the president. It also involves a series of domestic reforms insisted on by the European Union for any country to join, that only in the case of Ukraine, the parliament had control over. So inside the parliament, where there was much more pro-Western sentiment, major steps started to be taken to move Ukraine towards the European Union. More and more free trade agreements, free movement of peoples agreements, and various reforms to the political system, including oversight in the economy and in the political system, transparency in the economy and the political system, were being enacted by the parliament. And it's at this point that Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president, steps in and very, very abruptly, with little warning, cancels those efforts. And so in what felt to many Ukrainians like a sort of like snap decision or an overnight kind of change of course, Yanukovych himself begins to pull all that momentum that was moving Ukraine towards the West out from under everyone and begin, it seemed, moving the country towards the East. Yanukovych then proposes a series of new special ties and relationships with the Russian government, bringing everybody's sort of fears, every pro-Western Ukrainian's fears to light. And the result of that movement is this earthquake in 2014. In 2014, early in the year, actually by the end of 2013, this is underway, but it reaches a climax in January and February of 2014. Nationwide, protests occur across the country in which activists that are pro-Western denounce Yanukovych and his movement towards the East and make the case that it's really parliament and the pro-Western sentiment there that should win this argument. These protests span the entire country, including Eastern Ukraine. And the map you see here on your left, where these sort of stars these are indications of large-scale protests that happened during this time. The largest of these protests, however, that attracted the most international attention, but also attention inside Ukraine, are protests that took place in the heart of Kyiv, the capital city, and specifically in a central public square outside the parliament building called Maidan Square. Because of that location, these protests became known as the Euromaidan protests. So the spirit of these protests was to say to Yanukovych, no, Ukraine wants to move towards the West. You can't do this. Now, as those protests escalated, Yanukovych dug himself into a deeper and deeper hole. At a certain point, by the time we reached the beginning of calendar year 2014, people inside the Yanukovych government decide to use repressive violence against those protesters as a way to quell those protests. So police literally attack protesters in Maidan Square with clubs. That doesn't work. That doesn't deter the protesters. Violence then escalates. Snipers from rooftops shoot into the crowd. And in the bloodiest day of the protest, 101 people are killed by security forces. But again, those protesters are not deterred. And what they do is, rather than relinquish the square, they begin to build homemade barricades of debris, of furniture, of cars, of whatever they could get their hands on, to essentially build a wall between themselves and security forces so that they can continue to occupy this public space to make their demands known, not just to Yanukovych, but to the world. So these protests escalate, they get really intense. And at their darkest moment, violence is followed by a massive fire that burns down the barricades, but protesters refuse to leave. What then happens is, because of the sort of spiraling nature of this crisis, the parliament begins to make moves to remove Yanukovych from power. Yanukovych sees the writing on the wall. And in February of 2014, he literally disappears. He leaves the country. No one knows where he is. In retrospect, many people speculate that he figured if he lost the presidency, if he was removed from office but was still in Ukraine, he would likely immediately be indicted on corruption charges and other charges of abuse of power stemming from the violence used against protesters. And so he was likely fleeing in advance of being removed from office to save his own skin. But as soon as it's clear that he's left the country, the parliament goes ahead with the process of removing him from president. And only then he appears, we figure out where he's gone, and no surprise, he's in Russia. Yanukovych, to this day, remains in Russia. So that left Ukraine in this situation where regular people, protesters on the streets, had said to Ukraine, to Russia, and to the world, we want to move towards the West. This is our desire. This is what our sovereign choice is. But what that creates then, through no fault of the people of Ukraine, is a sharp backlash from the Russian government. From the Russian perspective, Yanukovych was a fantastic ally, somebody who would allow the Russian neighbor of Ukraine to continue to exert influence and control over the policies of Ukraine. With Yanukovych gone, within literally 24 hours, Russian forces begin to flow into Ukraine in two different regions. The first is the Crimean Peninsula, which is located in the south of Ukraine. The Crimean Peninsula is strategically important to Russia and to the entire region, and so it was sort of like a top priority for Russia to regain some control over. But Russia also sends forces to invade into the far east of Ukraine. But there's a catch here, and it's that the invading Russian forces are playing a sort of trick. They send Russian forces into these two regions, but they do so with those soldiers wearing uniforms that bear absolutely no identifying insignias. In other words, the world is pretty clear that Russian soldiers are moving into Ukraine, but it's very hard to identify them and distinguish them from, say, homegrown separatists, people in Ukraine who might feel a sort of militarized sympathy towards Russia. So on the ground, things are very confusing and very fast moving. Within only a few months, Crimea is completely controlled by Russian forces, and Russia then goes through a sort of facade version of a referendum to annex Crimea. To this day, Crimea remains disputed territory. Russia controls it like de facto, but Ukraine still rightfully claims it. But what this also did, and what many Westerners who watched the Crimea crisis unfold then later then later forgot, right? It fell out of their consciousness, was that the Russian invasion in the east of Ukraine ended up sparking a civil war that then Russia was happy to continue to stoke and fuel. And that civil war has been going on since 2014. It is still going on. Specifically, it's happening in the Donbass, which is a sort of aging industrial center for Ukraine. And to this day, that civil war, so pre-invasion that we're talking about today, pre-invasion, that civil war alone has claimed to date roughly 14,000 lives. And again, before today's invasion, right, the most recent invasion, displaced 1 million people. And so many of the people who are now Ukrainian refugees fleeing the country were already displaced from their homes in eastern Ukraine. It's just that they fled elsewhere, but remained in Ukraine. But once the 2021 Russian invasion began, those people were in even more of a desperate situation. So it's in this sense then that Russia becomes obviously way more aggressive after 2014, and there's this much more unified sense among Ukrainians that we are a country that wants to move towards the West. It's in that sense then that 2014 becomes this watershed moment. With Yanukovych, the former Russian president now deposed, a special election has to be called to replace him. So there's a new presidential election, and that new presidential election produces a race in which the top two candidates, the two candidates most likely to win, not through any manipulation by the government, but because of changing public attitudes, the two candidates most likely to win were both pro-EU, pro-West. In this election, the candidate that ends up winning is fervently pro-West. His name is Poroshenko. And he attracts so much support that he actually wins in excess of 50% of the nationwide vote in a race with many, many candidates. In other words, he achieves a really strong mandate because so many people opt for him as a candidate. One candidate that runs in the 2014 race even specifically calls for the separatist regions, the areas of the civil war, to just be pushed out of Ukraine and given to Russia. That candidate achieves only 8% of the nationwide vote. So what's clear here is, right, there's this shift. This East-West divide in Ukraine still exists, but it no longer is something that can produce a presidential election between competing visions of a Ukraine that's either aligned with the West or aligned with the East. It is a Westernized country. From there, I wanted to share that public opinion polls were taken in and around the context of this election, specifically asking people whether they supported or opposed unification with Russia, meaning their province leaving Ukraine and joining Russia. And even in the easternmost provinces of Ukraine, a majority of people in those provinces indicate that they were opposed to, quote unquote, unifying with Russia. What that brings us to is the most recent round of presidential elections, where this sort of watershed politics comes to its full fruition. And that's the election of this guy who now, if we're following this story closely in the international press, we all know very well. This is the election of President Zelensky. 2019, Zelensky runs for president, and he challenges the incumbent, Poroshenko, who had been a pro-Western candidate as well. Zelensky is also pro-West, and Zelensky ends up winning a landslide election victory. He crushes Poroshenko, and the map on the left gives you an indication of where his strongest support came from. Zelensky saw his strongest support come not from the west of Ukraine, but from the east, and yet he was running as a pro-West, pro-EU candidate. His election as president is then followed by parliamentary elections. And he, at the last minute, right, like in very ad hoc fashion, creates his own political party. And that party dominates the parliamentary election. So much so that the party he leads, for the first time ever, has a standalone majority in Ukraine's parliament, and he can work with them to continue the reforms he was proposing, pro-Western reforms. And so it's in that sense that you can imagine from a Russian perspective, which I am in no way defending, you can see a Russia that might feel threatened about the imminent departure of Ukraine from their sphere of influence. Okay, so I'll wrap up there. I hope I haven't taken up too much time, and I hope I've gotten us off to a good start. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Nick. And if you want to end your screen share, we can transition to the next speaker. Thank you. All right, so with that, we will actually transition back to our first planned speaker of the evening, and we will be transitioning to Dr. Matt Wettstein, the president of Cabrillo College. I'll just do a quick summary of his introduction from before as well. So he graduated with a political science degree in Northern Illinois University, focusing on Soviet foreign policy and the connections between the US and the nuclear arms race and arms control agreement. And he has some exciting content to share with us tonight. So thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Kendall, and thank you, Nick, so much for the terrific introduction to the domestic politics. And my apologies, I'm at a conference in Southern California and I have unstable internet. So I switched over and I'm toggling off my phone, and hopefully that will work well. Kendall, thanks for organizing tonight, and thanks to the other speakers. I'm going to focus very narrowly on a particular issue that spins out of Nick's talk about domestic politics in Ukraine and focus on the domestic impact of Ukraine and its food production for the world, really. And so I want to set first the broader context and the things that I will not be addressing, and then sort of dive into this discussion about the impact of food and food production. So I'm not going to talk about the devastating humanitarian crisis that's going on right now. As Nick pointed out, there already was a refugee crisis as a result of the invasion, really, of the eastern regions and the takeover of Crimea. To this date, the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees reports that there are now 5.3 million refugees who have left Ukraine as a result of the invasion. And what we have unfolding very quickly in the last 2 months is a series of war crimes that have been perpetrated against the people of Ukraine. The domestic presentation that Nick gave actually puts the lie to the claim that the Russians were trying to denazify Ukraine, which is just a ridiculous assertion. And we have the threat of a wider European conflict because of this sort of imperial Russian vision that Vladimir Putin has for Russia, and what appears to be a rise of a new Cold War, which I'll talk about more towards the end of my talk. So let's talk a little bit about the significance of Ukraine as an engine of food production. California is widely known as the breadbasket, actually the salad bowl of the world. And the agricultural production of our state helps drive a large part of our GDP. People often overlook it, but the volume of exports out of California for food production in world trade was $22 billion in 2020. Ukraine far exceeds that, and prior to the war was reporting $27 billion in exports, much of it in cereal and in things like corn, wheat, barley. The significance of that is for folks who live in California to think about that and the importance of ag to Santa Cruz County, for example, or the Central Valley or Salinas Valley, is to think about taking, let's say, 1/5 of the entire economy of California and devastating it by a war. Because what you're going to see during the next few months is a radical impact on food production, I think, in Ukraine and therefore in world markets. And it's already had a devastating impact. Let's talk a little bit about the volume of production here that we see that comes from Ukraine. If you just look at corn and wheat exports as a volume of international trade, Ukraine is at 13% of the corn export production and is at 8% of overall wheat exports. And in many ways, Russia obviously trumps Ukraine in terms of wheat production. But the significance of those is to think again about removing some of that production from foodstuffs that go into world markets. Why is that happening? If you think about it just in the moment of wheat and its production and when it gets exported, it's very much like winter wheat in the United States. And so when it's planted, when it's grown, and when it gets exported is on a calendar that is very much being impacted by the war, by the invasion that Russia has created. And now we get into a planting season that's coming up that's going to impact other areas of production within the Ukraine. So if you think about this calendar borrowed from a graphic from the US Farm Bureau, American Farm Bureau, there are various crops that get planted in the spring months that will commonly happen and be large export drivers for Ukraine, along with the United States. And so that planting season is in threat of being disrupted quite significantly as this war goes on and as Russia engages in a systematic campaign of trying to destroy the infrastructure of the country. And so as we go forward in time, and as long as Russian troops are able to prohibit or prevent or erect barriers to production or the regular means of production that happen in the country, we're going to see a devastating impact on the people of Ukraine and on world markets and food production. So the ripple effects of this are really quite stunning. We're already seeing from news coverage that's coming out of Ukraine that the planting cycles of crops that are usually grown are being disrupted in some ways to help feed people in Ukraine as they go through this devastating humanitarian crisis. So there's a report that came from Reuters earlier this year suggesting that there's a greater emphasis on planting spring crops that they know they can harvest quicker, that may not be in the ground as long, because of the uncertainty that farmers are facing in the Ukraine. So the normal production that would come out of Ukraine and get exported to its largest destination sites, Western Europe, places like China, North Africa, are all being disrupted by this war. Then you start to think about the disruption of port activity coming out of the Black Sea and the limitations on exporting wheat that has already been harvested. There's a suggestion that out of all the wheat that was grown in the last winter wheat cycle, there was still a good 25% that was sitting and now is unable to be shipped out into world markets, having the impact of raising prices and also limiting the ability of agencies like the United Nations to help feed the world and particularly feed the poor throughout the world. So we're already beginning to see these incredible shortages and inflationary pressures show up in world food markets. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, for example, has a regular metric that they track for commodities that measures what they call the food price index. It's a basket of 5 commodities that they track the volume of trade, and then they essentially index it to $2004 to help control for inflationary pressures that would happen anyway. And what's happened in the last year, if you measure from February to February and look at that one particular metric from the UN FAO, is almost a 20% increase in the food production index. And that's tied to important commodities like wheat, corn, and barley. That 1 year increase of almost 20% is the highest ever that's been recorded by the United Nations on that particular food index. And the other significant factor here in terms of Ukraine's production of food, its alliance with the West, its growing connection to international regimes like the United Nations, the food FAO, is that the Ukraine production that we're talking about was not only helping to feed Europe and helping to feed other countries, it was also going into the World Food Program that's run by the United Nations. And as much as 25% of the food that was used by the United Nations to feed the poor throughout the world was coming from Ukraine. And so the crisis that's starting to develop is not just in Ukraine and Europe, as devastating as that is. The new crisis that's going to be emerging through world markets and throughout the globe is the tremendous amount of food insecurity and people who are in poverty, who have been dependent upon the United Nations for food production, are now going to be impacted even more by the loss of that production from Ukraine. It's really quite devastating. So I'm going to close very quickly by just talking about some broader themes that exist within international relations teaching about where I was when I was a student going through my program in the 1980s and early 90s. One of the reasons I got into international relations to study it was because of the Cold War that existed with the Soviet Union and the United States, and the tremendous buildup of arms, nuclear arms in particular, that took place over time around this theme of mutual assured destruction. We never got to the point of using those nuclear weapons during the Cold War because we always had the capacity, if either side launched a weapon, to assure the destruction of the other side during that possibility. And so that Cold War actually stayed cold because of the threat of nuclear annihilation. But what happened, and Nick pointed to this, is that we engaged in a series of proxy wars around the globe, in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. And so the war was visited upon the poor of the lesser developed world, so to speak. And it was orchestrated from the United States perspective, from a perspective of containment, a constant series of actions, policies, regime building treaties designed to contain Soviet aggression and to ensure that communism would not spread throughout the world. It feels to me like we're entering a new phase, a new breakpoint, where my fear is that we're entering new phases of proxy wars and a potential need for the United States to contemplate a new form of containment, now focused on Russian aggression. And you see that now in our ability as a United States to try not to go to direct war with Russia, but rather engage in a series of economic sanctions that are designed to bring the Russian economy to its knees, in a series of military and political moves that send as much military equipment, aid, training, personnel, perhaps in the future, to the Ukraine, to not directly engage with Russia, but provide the military might to perhaps knock it down in Ukraine. So it's a new Cold War. I wish it weren't here, and I fear for the impact that might come out in the next few months related to the lost food production that happens in Ukraine. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was very much appreciated for that insight. And next, we will be transitioning to hear from Dr. Jamila Yukadeva. Dr. Jamila has a PhD in political science and is an instructor in political science here at Cabrillo College. Jamila was born and raised in the USSR and has family and friends in Ukraine and Russia. And she will share on the competing theoretical frameworks to understand why Russia attacked Ukraine. So thank you.
Thank you, Kendall. Thank you, Nick and Matt, for your granular presentations. And I'll do something the opposite. I will be more general, and I'll do something controversial, throw in my personal view here. So, since for the last 2 months since the invasion, I've been living in a fog. Again, first, the nonsensical invasion of Ukraine, we were all in denial, believing whenever somebody asked me, do you think Russia is going to invade Ukraine? I took a second and no, Putin is not crazy, he's rational, he's not going to do it. So that was a big shock when he invaded. Then all the vicious atrocities against the civilians. Again, I've been having nightmares for every single night for the last 2 months. It's just really affecting a lot, not just me, but a lot of people that I talk to. So with this foggy mind, I try to make sense of the events. And I would like to share some of my observations. So, and I organize those observations along questions. So why is this happening? What can we learn from it? And what can we do to help the situation? So why is this happening? So one of the most common explanations that are out there, you hear a lot, is that, well, Russia is responding to an existential threat posed to it by NATO's expansion in Eastern Europe. It's somehow the fault of the West because we've pushed democracy too far. We've pushed NATO's expansion too far to the border of Russia, and that expansion is posing the threat to Russia, and Russia has nothing else left, no choice but invade Ukraine. So that's one of the most common explanations there. Well, this explanation doesn't make sense to me as much as I tried to think about it and took it at face value, and I read a lot of materials and listened to a lot of interviews looking for evidence to support that theory. And I couldn't convince myself that that's the case, because the only countries that I see facing a real existential threat here is Ukraine, not Russia. Plus, NATO has been at the Russian border since 2004. In 2004, two countries, Latvia and Estonia, joined NATO. Both of them border Russia. So NATO was already at Russia's border since 2004. Why didn't Russia feel the existential threat back then? On top of it, in 2008, when the first time officially, well, not officially, when 2008, when Ukraine expressed its interest in joining NATO in Romania, Bucharest in 2008, three countries, Great Britain, Germany, and France, publicly, very adamantly, came out with a public statement saying Ukraine is not going to be admitted into NATO. Again, the basis for that was they did not want Putin to feel threatened. They didn't want to encroach on Putin's territory. So Ukraine was very angry about that statement. There's still, a lot of Ukrainians are still holding a grudge at France and Germany for making that statement in Bucharest. So I do not see any meaningful existential threat to Russia's interest coming from outside. The only existential threat to Russia's survival that I see is coming from within Russia. The authoritarian rule based on corruption that resulted in poor governance and decline of its own power. If Russia is feeling threatened, it's not due to Western world's actions, but due to its own mismanagement and corruption. So that's my view. My cat came into the room, sorry. So that's the theory of realism. Well, I don't see strong evidence to support that theory. Again, this is my personal view. The other competing theory is liberalism, the theory of liberalism, suggesting that the invasion is a result of failed multinational institutions, ineffective international laws. So this theory says that such organizations, international organizations as NATO, European Union, United Nations, the Geneva Convention, the human rights laws, the International Criminal Court, that they are somehow badly designed, that they are ineffective, the laws are ineffective, unenforceable, and that's why Russia is behaves this way. And I do see some truth in this explanation. I do see NATO and European Union showing a lack of unity. Just to bring an anecdotal example, just a couple of weeks ago, I met my friend who was born in Odessa, Ukraine. She came to the United States at the age of 10, went to UCLA, got her PhD in history of Russia, and now she works in European Union in Belgium as a librarian. So when we of course we talked about Ukraine. How can we not? And when I asked her, well, how come when will Europeans wean themselves from Russian oil? When will European Union stop buying Russian oil? Her answer was, she looked at me as if that was a foolish question and saying, well, how can we not buy oil? We rely on them to heat our houses. Restaurants will be shut down. So to her, it was not even a possibility of stopping buying Russian oil. And that is somebody who was born in Ukraine, somebody who is trained in Russian history, somebody who lives in Europe. So I see the whole lack of unity in European Union, forget about even the world, in this response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I see the leaders saying the right things, but not doing enough. I do not see that enough unity and action on the part. The international laws that were violated by Russia repeatedly. Look at in the early 90s, Russia supported pro-Russian separatists in Moldova. Nobody paid attention to that. In 2008, Russia violated Georgia's sovereignty. International community waged its finger at Germany, that is it. In the early 2000s, Russia committed crimes against humanity in Chechnya. World looked the other way. In 2014, Russia violated Ukraine's sovereignty. Again, the response was very weak. In Syria, Russia committed war crimes. Again, the world, response was very weak. So that shows that international laws are weak, that the international institutions that are created to back up these laws are weak, and such behavior, when it's left unpunished, emboldens authoritarians, emboldens Putin, makes him feel that he can get away with more. Why stop there if he can get away with more? So I believe that that's something that we can learn from the situation, is that we should not appease leaders who violate international laws, and act in a more unified way. Well, what else do I see? One interesting thing that actually scares me, that I've noticed happening, is the narrative of victimhood. The victimhood nationalism started to emerge in Russia about 10 years ago. According to that narrative, it's not only the Americans who wronged Russia, it's also Soviet policies somehow are to be blamed for putting Russia at a disadvantage. It's the Ukrainians, Nazis, it's the Anglo-Saxon elites, world elites, it's the Clintons. Anyone they can get their eyes on are blamed for Russia's problems. Russia's media is full of blamehood, and it's a whole rabbit hole that is scary to go into. I try to look into it. It's scary to go there. It's how aggressive and how well put together, and how much of it. So by promoting the victimhood narrative, Putin channels people's anger at third parties and strengthens his own grip on power. Remember, the autocrats' number one goal is to stay in power. Autocrats generally do not fare very well once they are deposed. So they do everything possible to stay in power as long as possible. So Putin chose to blame everyone around and present himself as a savior so he can stay in power. So that is according to, that explanation is the most plausible to me, that makes sense to me. And it's called rational choice theory. That's from comparative politics, not international relations. But that's the theory that says leaders do what they do to benefit their own interests. And right now, number one interest for President Putin is to strengthen his grip in power, to stay longer in power, because he knows the day he loses power, most likely he will lose his freedom at best, or life at worst. So what can we do? What can be done on individual level? Well, first of all, I think we all know that Putin's power is based on the hydrocarbon industry. So we need to stay focused on the agenda of clean energy, reduce our reliance on hydrocarbon energy, as most of today's dictatorships are directly financed by hydrocarbon industries and extractive industries, diamonds, gold, coal, oil, natural gas. And Putin's power relies on hydrocarbon oligarchy. So to weaken the hydrocarbon oligarchy, we should speed up our own move towards the clean energy. We need to wean ourselves off oil and gas by curtailing our own oil consumption and switch to alternative energy as soon as possible. The current sanctions will not make a difference as long as the West keeps buying oil from Russia. Think about it. In the last 2 months, the international community altogether has provided military assistance to Ukraine in total, most $20 billion. That's the total military assistance. But at the same amount of time in the last 2 months, we paid Russia of about $70 billion. So we give Ukraine 20 billion to fight Russia, and then we give Russia 70 billion for the oil. Doesn't make sense. So that's one of the things we can do, is promote clean energy. Second, resist the resurgence of fascism, racism, nationalism at home. As we can see, it can spill into international politics. That's what we see happening in Russia, is that fascism, racism, that's another new concept, racism, nationalism spilling over into international politics. Resist the need to disengage, educate yourself and others, don't shy away from difficult conversations. US as a country should continue to invest in information capabilities to be ready to engage in informational wars. We, the teachers, the educators, should promote information literacy among our students, teaching them how to distinguish opinions from facts, how to evaluate sources of information. Again, this war is not just military war, it's also an informational war. And both sides are quite well equipped in that. Another thing that we can do on a personal individual level is think about ways we raise our children. Issues such as domestic violence, bullying, these are all under control that we can manage ourselves, and we need to raise our own children and run our families that promote peaceful behavior, not violent behavior. And again, these are one of the theories of feminism, is saying that if you want to avoid wars, international wars, start with your family, or focus on your family, and that's how you resolve future international wars, is by raising your families to be peaceful. And my Ukrainian friends asked me to remind people to be mindful of the words we use when we speak about the conflict. For example, instead of saying Ukrainian conflict, they asked me to say Russian invasion, because by saying Ukrainian conflict, we imply as if there is Ukraine somehow is implicated here. So stay engaged. Do not get used to this conflict. Do not push it back on a back burner somewhere. Well, that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was great to hear your perspectives. We really appreciate it. Up next, we're going to be hearing from Anna Zagorska and Motoko Nakazawa-Hewitt. And just a quick introduction to them both. So Anna is originally from Poland and has her master's in international studies with a focus on Russia and Eastern European studies. And additionally, she has been working with international students from around the world since 1999 and is in a variety of institutions and strives to create a better understanding of the world through education, kind of like Jamila just mentioned as well. And there is Anna for us. And then also we will be listening to Motoko Nakazawa-Hewitt, who came to the US as an international student from Japan in 1997 and studied counseling at Oregon State University, and since then has worked at several community colleges in Washington, Oregon, and California, and has a lot of experience with international students from many different countries. Motoko's passion is in helping bring positive change to the community through cross-cultural understanding and awareness. And so together they co-coordinate international student services at Cabrillo College, and they both have been in the field of international education for almost 2 decades, working with students who experience a variety of crises. And tonight they will share a little bit from their experiences on the international student perspective. So thank you both to Motoko and Anna.
Thank you so much. Motoko is going to share our slides, I think. And I just want to really thank the speakers that came ahead of us, Matt and Nick and Jamila, to really introduce the complexity of the situation and let us know just the details of what is going on in Ukraine. And then also, Jamila, to follow your example, we're actually going to be Zooming kind of globally and then also locally at the same time by talking about some of the students that we have here on campus and some of the issues and concerns that arise for students who are away from their home countries and experiencing the trauma of different kinds of situations. So thanks, Kendall, for that introduction. So we wanted to just give a brief overview of the Cabrillo International Student Program. We have between 40 and 80 students, kind of depending on the semester, here with us from as many as 30 different countries. It's a very diverse program. We don't have just one population from one place. It is a wonderfully rich group that supports each other and really just has a lot of diversity. The services that we provide is their immigration F1 visa advising. We do academic counseling, so helping them pick classes, figuring out cultural activities and events, doing the personal advising and counseling, which is where this part kind of comes into mostly, but then also helping with unfamiliarity with the US educational system and culture, and really trying to break it down for students and help them out with just general questions as they come up when you live in a new place, right? And then lastly, a big part of our job is also advocacy for them with various agencies, local, governmental, and also even with their instructors. So that's kind of an overview of the program.
Next, I'm going to be talking about the restriction for international students. Because of their student visa status, their status is very restricted. They have to follow federal government requirements and regulations besides Cabrillo regulations. So each student has to be full-time every semester, which is 12 units, and that's a requirement. And they're not allowed to establish California residency. So regardless how many years they lived in California, as long as you're a student and they're on F1 visa, they will never earn California residency. And those years they lived in California won't count toward residency status. They're not allowed to work off campus. Only way to get a job is on campus, unless they have special circumstances, special permit. Usually those permit doesn't come easily. So only way to earn and also financial support is gonna be on campus job. They're not allowed to receive government funds. So sometimes when they go to the hospital, go to see the doctor, and if they don't have insurance, sometimes they might offer the support from the hospital for the insured patients. They're not allowed to receive any of those funds, and that might affect their future status for the visa. And also, because they're a student and they're on student visa, they have to make academic progress.
So this brings us kind of to the heart of the matter, is when a crisis occurs, international students are in a challenging situation, right? Because they've got all these restrictions, and they are often quite alone. So while I was extolling the beauty of having such a diverse group of students, it also kind of leads to, there's a lot of folks, they're just alone here from their countries. And actually, usually Ukraine is one of those. So we've had Ukrainian students, but right now we only have one student. And so I'll just use that as an example of when a war breaks out, what happens. And Motoko and I proactively work to reach out to students. And in this particular situation, we were quite supported by student services and the campus as a whole, especially the foundation, in not only checking in with the student, offering services, but also finding emergency assistance, financial assistance right away, knowing that the student could not just go get a job, right? So just when a war breaks out, you have these immediate needs where, where's my money going to be coming from? Oh my goodness, is my family, I mean, of course, this is the bigger one. Is my family okay? You know, what's happening with my home and my country? But then also the immediate of, I'm here alone and things are very challenging. So part of what we do is really try to assist with that. So in a war, of course, that is clear how we would do that. Some other examples are coming up. So Motoko.
The next one is natural disasters. The example will be when a big earthquake happened in Japan and big tsunami attacked. Many students could not locate their families. Phone line was disturbed. Internet was not working, and they couldn't find their own families, and also financial issues too. They couldn't get the funds from Japan. Maybe their sponsors lost their jobs. So we did help students to apply for work visa, which is for the extenuating circumstances with the natural disasters. And same issues. They don't have families here, so they don't have someone to rely on. At the same time, their home country is not safe to go back. So those are the time that they kind of get stuck between two countries, and we are here to help them.
Other items that come up, economic crises such as Venezuela. We've had Venezuelan students where suddenly saw their currency plummet, and trying to figure out, okay, how do you best do this? And working just like with what Motoko just said, working to find government help through different kinds of programs that get developed for citizens of countries that are experiencing these issues.
Political crisis is we had a student from China. She was transgender, and she was at the risk of being politically prosecuted back home, and she feels safe in US. At the same time, she's too scared to go back home to think about what would happen if she goes home. However, because international student visa is basically non-immigrant visa, meaning your intention is temporary and you will have to go back home eventually. So that's a big struggle. It's not easy problem to solve, but we wanted to mention that as a political crisis.
And then, of course, family, being away from your family. If something happens, if somebody gets ill, if somebody passes away, not being there is just incredibly challenging. And so sometimes immediate travel arrangements need to be made. Of course, in the last 2 years, that has been even more difficult with the COVID pandemic and not being able to travel. And that also develops into its own just really difficult situation.
Health crisis, this could happen to any students. We had a student who was hospitalized in ICU and family had to fly in. We had students who had a schizophrenic episode and she was held in a behavior unit, and the nurse had to escort her back home. And those times, again, they don't have families to support, and we are almost like adoptive family for them. So they will contact us and ask for help. So we do everything we could to help those situations.
And then really what we wanted to stress is what can we do really as a community to support students that are going through this, going through these kinds of crises, going through a war at home that you just, as Jamila said, if you've got family and connections to that place, you're not sleeping right now. You're not functioning well. You're very traumatized and in a complete state of shock. And so what can we do as a community to support them? Well, listening. One of the things is really listening without judgment, in fact, because there's going to be different sides and different experiences. And it is really important for us to try to listen without taking sides, just folks that are here.
And keep an open mind. Many students feel like they're ambassadors from their countries and they feel like they have to represent where they're from. It's important for us to keep open-minded and then being able to learn from them and their experiences.
Right. Being welcoming, and I just saw Terry put in the chat of just how important it is in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom, of letting people know that and students know that they are welcome here.
And also, I think it's important as a college and also community to share that where we stand when Asian hate violence happened, that the college put some statement, and I think it is important for students to hear that where we stand to support students. And I think instead of reactive, we should be active for that.
One thing also, sometimes, what we imagine as a transgression, maybe in the classroom or even a social mistake, there could be some punitive measures. Step back and think about, okay, maybe this person is coming from a different culture and they have different understandings. So reaching out to students before any kind of punitive measures.
And we're here to help students. We might have students from same countries, or we might have someone from that country or background, so we can pair them up or consult or create the community for them. So if you have any students you've seen struggling, please refer them to us.
And we also partner with others on campus, especially the student health services. When a crisis does come up, they are invaluable to us, and the counselors in student health are just incredible. So we also encourage other folks to refer to student health services, because sometimes that is one of the only places where international students can go easily without having to navigate a really complicated bureaucracy of our both just the medical system and the mental health system. So really, we just wanted to leave you with that of just to be mindful of the students that we have here, and that they're going through a variety of things. They're very excited to be here, but it's also very hard, and they could be going through trauma that we don't even know about. And there are, and as we mentioned, it is just, it's weighing on them heavily. So thank you for being here and for caring. And we would love to hear from you if you would like to do anything to support our students. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna and Motoko. I think it's also interesting to note that there's a huge international student community in Ukraine too. So hearing about those experiences, what all goes into that, how stressful that must be for some of the students there too. And so I think that your perspective can help us think about a lot of different things. So thank you so much for sharing. And up next, we are actually going to be hearing from Ewelina Bieranowska, who is a library technician at Cabrillo College. Ewelina is originally from Poland. All of her friends and relatives are there. She was born in Poland and lived there until 29. In 2011, she came to the US, and she went through all levels of education in Poland up until her physics degree. And she is continuing education as a re-entry student and has really found her passion in the library field at Cabrillo College. Ewelina holds sentiment and affection for her culture and Slavic roots and wishes to represent the voice and people of cultural expression. Ukraine is a close neighbor of Poland on the east border, and Ewelina is familiar with the situation of Ukrainian refugees in Poland. Polish people think very warmly of Ukrainian people and as their Slavic brothers and more. And so we have listed some resources where you can help on the resources page. And we just hope that you can enjoy all that Ewelina has to share with us and listen to her unique experience. So thank you, Ewelina.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really glad to be here and share my perspective with you. I will have a presentation and I will have some snippets of the video. So please be patient if I sometimes need to jump between the parts of them because I don't want to occupy a lot of time, but I made a selected segments, and I would like to bring the experience of refugees, experience of Polish civilians, and really of the people and the present moment. I will share my screen shortly. So when the current invasion started in February, Polish people started with a lot of protests. It started on the very first day. I think that will be my perspective, but in a Polish heart, it's almost like it happened to us because we have the history of war. And in the beginning now, I would like to share with you a war song from 1943. The poet Krzysztof Kamil Baczyński, who died in Warsaw Uprising, and that time of Polish history, which we hold in our hearts because it's the significance of our ancestors who fought for us now. And Poland is very strong on teaching history and of keeping the true, historical true. So I would like to dedicate this performance from 2020 from the Theatre Buffo from Warsaw by Natasza Urbańska. And shortly in the end, and after that, I will read the translation of the poem for you. This will be a short part of the performance.
Niebo złote ci otworzę, w którym ciszy biała nić, jak ogromny dźwięków orzech, który pęknie, aby żyć. Zielonymi listeczkami, śpiewem jezior, zmierzchu graniem, aż ukaże jądro mleczne, ptasi świst. Jeno wyjmij mi z tych oczu szkło bolesne, obraz dni, który czaszki białe toczy przez płonące łąki krwi. Jeno odmień czas kaleki, zakryj groby płaszczem rzeki, zetrzyj z włosów pył bitewny, tych lat gniewnych, czarny pył.
This is a translation. I will open for you a golden sky, where the white thread of silence is, like a great knot with sound inside, which breaks into that it might live. Through small green leaves, the song of lakes, the music that twilight makes, until its milky kernels shone by the bird-like dawn. Only from my eyes take out the stabbing shard of glass, the days, image, by which white skulls are brought over meadows of blood ablaze. Only change the cripple's time, cover the gravestones with a cloak of river, the dust of battle, wipe from my hair those angry years, black dust. Krzysztof Kamil Baczyński, June 15, 1943. I didn't bring this poem and this performance as a random choice, because about 2 weeks ago I posted something on social media with a modern song including this poet, and that was only for close friends circle. Right away I receive a notification that this post is banned from Russia and Belarus. So that's a side note. That. And then I am moving here to the first day of Russian invasion, when Polish people reacted. They went to the streets, they protest. February 24th, 2022, I'm sorry for a mistake here. This is only one of the cities. If I will start bringing lots of examples, that would be whole country, but I can bring examples: Warsaw, Krakow, Szczecin, Łódź, Kielce, and this is Wrocław. This is only one city, and 100,000 protesters gathered that evening. In Polish culture, we have a lot of history of solidarizing, coming to the streets, and that's definitely one of our slogans, which people scream, is that solidarity is our weapon. That will be something what is referred to the previous era of the communism, when the solidarity fought for the solidarity movement fought for the democracy. And here I have a video. I will play it for you and read the description. This is without sound. According to Ukraine refugee situation data portal set up by the United Nations Refugee Agency, more than 4.5 million people, mostly women and children, have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries following the military offensive of February 24 by Russian armed forces. Most took refuge in Poland, about 2.6 million, with the rest in descending order going to Romania, Hungary, Moldova, Russia, Slovakia, and Belarus. These numbers are as of April 10, 2022. They are updated regularly and are expected to increase as the conflict stretches in a time and space. This is the sources Center for Immigration Studies. So what is happening in Poland? How refugees can be taken care of? What they receive? And this is a summary, at least, how Poland is helping. All the refugees from Ukraine receive a free healthcare, free childcare, and free education. They receive a PESEL, which is similar to SSN number. This is an identification number, which will help them to sign up for many social services, for healthcare, and also approve them to have work right away. Each of them receive 300 zlotys. That's a stimulus per one person, which is, it may be surprising for you, the calculation for currency, it's only $67. But the cost of life is different in Poland, is definitely lower than here. Support for families, they have taken refugees home, and here that I'm referring to the Polish families. They will receive 40 zlotys a day, which is 1,200 zlotys a month for first 60 days. 40 zlotys is almost $9, and 1,200 zlotys is almost $270. And Poland has population of 38 million people. And up until now, until February, we were home for the population of about 1 million immigrants from Ukraine. In past about 5-7 years, people were arriving to work in Poland, already dislocated from Ukraine. So they have strong connection with the arriving refugees. And of course, this is just 1 million, because we are speaking about the 3 million arriving, but the refugees from Ukraine, if they have a connection in Poland with a family member or friend, first they reach out to them. And I know from the personal conversations about people or Ukrainian people hosting in a one bedroom apartment 18 Ukrainian refugees. So those are really huge numbers, and that can be really overwhelming. Next come civilians from Poland, and there was really reaction from Polish people right away. Some people refer to that, we can really say openly it was improvised, because some people left everything, just drove to the border to help to pick up the refugees, to transport them where they can. And I will have a few videos for you. Here's a tweet from the Border Patrol. It's from 27th of April, so pretty much current. This is February 24th, through the Polish border from Ukraine to Poland went 3 million people. And this is a 27th of April. The number is here 24,000 people of that day, which is increased of 16%. And there is this is a data of a day and of an hour. There is a 7 p.m. It's 7,000 people. Here is a map by the source Polska Times, where the Ukrainian refugees are escaping. So you can see this humongous number of almost 3 million go to Poland, but you have also Slovenia, about 350,000 people, Hungary, 480,000 people, Romania, almost 800,000, Moldavia, 430, Belarus, 23,000, and Russia, about 600,000. Here are the stories I will be sharing with you.
Приємно. Всі мають можливість подякувати, але я дякую від усіх, від своєї родини і від усіх українців. Дуже приємно, що ваша
She's giving huge thanks from herself, her family, and also in the name of all Ukrainian people.
Небайдужність, доброта, небайдужність до нас, українців. Дуже приємно.
She's saying that this is so nice that Polish people are kind, nice, and welcoming, and first of all, that they are not neutral, that they really care.
Dokładnie to trzeci dzień, trzecie miejsce, więc...
Nie pierwsze przejście, tak?
Hrubieszów, Przemyśl i dzisiaj Hreberna.
This man is waiting to pick up the refugees, and he's on the place of the border waiting for people. This is a third day he's waiting for them.
Ale to skąd się pan dowiaduje?
Albo mamy kontakty do wolontariuszy, albo właśnie w trasie ktoś daje znać, że ściąga ludzi i potrzebuje transportu.
So the way how he is in contact, it's only through the people who volunteer, or there are people who know, there are people who are connected with him and they know he's helping to transport refugees. So they are letting him know, and he listed 3 different towns where he's picking up the refugees.
Pomocą przyjechaliśmy, teraz generalnie będziemy też odbierać ludzi, tylko najpierw chcemy się dowiedzieć dokładnie, kto potrzebuje tej pomocy, bo jedziemy w stronę Katowic.
She said that they came back to help, but first they need to find who needs that help, and she listed the city Katowice, so she doesn't have any connection. She just came there to help.
Przywieźliśmy zaopatrzenie, pampersy, jedzenie, potrzebne takie rzeczy, które są na teraz generalnie.
And they also brought food with them. They brought diapers and anything was emergency right away. also, I won't play, but the part of this video is that there are volunteers who are, there are food trucks with free food. There are volunteers who can bring coffee to these people who are waiting for hours or days there for the refugees. This video is from Warsaw, and it shows one of the places where the refugees can stay.
Tylko i wyłącznie takie, brzydko mówiąc, poczekalnia, z czego my zrobiliśmy coś większego, coś lepszego z racji tego, że mamy i łóżeczka dla dzieci, i mikrofalówki, i warnik na gorącą wodę, i posiłki, jak również mamy zamówione też.
So this was the place, basically gym, athletic gym, and he was a manager of this place, but now this man has a different role. So they are doing everything to provide the refugees. There are, he listed microwaves, he listed kettles, food, any way that they could cook food and make it accessible and make the accommodation easy for the refugees.
Gorący posiłek, czyli obiad, żeby każdy zjadł z uchodźców.
He mentioned it's very important that every refugee will eat a really hot dinner, hot meal every day.
To miejsce działa na podobnej zasadzie jak te wielkie hale Expo, które już w Onecie pokazywaliśmy. Poza łóżkami, jedzeniem i tym wszystkim, czego potrzebują uciekinierzy.
He mentioned the big places where the Expo events take place, which also were given to the refugees. And not only the beds are given there, not only the food, but also the civilians bring a lot of donations. And this place, which he is showing here, are the clothing donation, and they are also organized by size so that refugees can easier find what they need.
Po raz drugi
która ich spotkała, o tej sytuacji, która ma miejsce na Ukrainie, o tym, że stracili dom, że znaleźli.
She's a representative of small towns, and she talks about the trauma and what the people went through in Ukraine. So they want to integrate the children together, Polish children and Ukrainian children, and they created this event when children can play, and of course their mothers are with them as well. And there is a short story.
Jedną z nich była Olesia, która pochodzi z Lwowa i wraz ze swoimi 3 synami zamieszkała u Agnieszki Lipień w Dębicy. Jej mąż i rodzice zostali bronić.
So this woman is Olesia, and she stayed in home of the other woman shown in a second before. She came to Poland with her 3 sons. She left her whole family in Lviv, which is not very far from Poland. In past, actually, it was a Polish city, but that's a pre-World War II time. And
W kraju ona w Polsce znalazła potrzebną pomoc i opiekę. Cieszy się, że jej dzieci są bezpieczne.
Я вже повіла Агнішки, це вона є злота людина і bardzo dziękuję jej za tę pomoc.
It's very beautiful what she's telling you, because her expressions are in a very Slavic way. She talks about the other woman. Her name is Agnieszka, that she's zlota, jedyna, which means she's gold and she's only one. So there's this Slavic connection, how we express each other. She's very grateful for all the help, but she's really longing for her family, and he wants to return home as soon as she can.
mocno się zaangażowały w tą pracę. Im bardzo z całego serca dziękuję. Dziękuję również właśnie tym mieszkańcom i naszym przedsiębiorcom, którzy również stanęli na wysokości zadania. Mieszkańcy sami na swój własny koszt również przyjęli około 200 osób z tej całej.
So this is from a city, Mielno, which is by the Baltic Sea in the North Poland. And she was a representative of a local government. And she's speaking about 200 refugees taken privately to Polish homes when the civilians stepped in.
Całej liczby, także to jest też ogromny gest wsparcia i otwarte serca z ich strony.
Jednymi z osób, które ugościły sąsiadów zza wschodniej granicy, są państwo radwańscy. Pod swój dach przyjęli 15 uchodźców. Jak przyznają,
This family, their name is Radwańscy, and they took under their roof 15 people.
zdążyli się już zżyć ze swoimi gośćmi i żyją niemalże jak rodzina.
Wczoraj mieliśmy borszt, po ukraińsku borszt. Dziewczyny zrobiły przepyszny. Drugie.
She's talking about they are cooking food together. They made borscht, which is a Ukrainian name for the soup, which we would call barszt. And she also expressing that they feel like a family together.
Wszystkim dziewczętom, które serdecznie zajmują się nami. Tak tu dobrze, jakbyśmy żyli w bajce. Nie mieliśmy pojęcia, że Polacy to taki...
She's saying that I thank all the women who are taking care of us because we are living here like in a fairy tale. We didn't know that Polish people are such a nation, such a good nation.
Dobry naród. Odziali nas, obuli, nakarmili. Nie mieliśmy niczego, bo uciekaliśmy tutaj.
They gave us food, they gave us clothing, they gave us everything because we didn't have anything, we were escaping.
I prosto ze schronu. 2 tygodnie siedzieliśmy w piwnicy. Daj wam Boże zdrowie i
She was escaping from the shelter when she was staying for 2 weeks. And then she's giving lots of wishes to Polish people, good wishes for God gifts. I will transition right away to the political connections. However, I won't be spending much time of it. Just a very short snippet how the President Zelensky was welcomed at when the Polish Sejm, which is legislative branch of our government, and Senate, had the celebration of 23rd anniversary of Poland joining NATO.
Myślę, że ukraińskim daje świadectwo szczególnego heroizmu i patriotyzmu. Bardzo proszę o zabranie głosu prezydenta Ukrainy, pana Wołodymyra Zełenskiego.
President Zelensky was speaking about the relation between Polish and Ukrainian nation. He mentioned that we didn't have easy history on all the times, but now we are brothers and sisters. He remembered the old history, and he knew that we weren't always united. In his words, he also declared that Ukraine is also fighting for Poland, and the victory will be shared with Poland. And he spoke in Polish language for good wishes for Polish nations, of course, expressing Sława Ukraini, Sława Polsce, niech żyje Polska, niech żyje Ukraina. On March 15th, I'm sorry, I have a mistake here. It's 2022. It was 20th day of war, and Polish government showed support to Ukraine, and it was performed secretly because a Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki and Vice Prime Minister Jarosław Kaczyński traveled to Kiev, and they traveled with representation of Czechia and Slovenia. They traveled on a train. It was gesture of support and solidarity, and Polish Vice Prime Minister spoke about the need of more wealthy countries to help and stand with Ukraine. He expressed that Ukraine is fighting for all of us and for the whole world. The mayor of Warsaw is currently visiting US. This is I know that we have a time limit, so I will provide this link later in our resources, because this is from the news, USA News, April 26th. And what Rafał Trzaskowski mentioned is that Warsaw is at the capacity as a city of population of 2 million that welcome 300,000 people. And it's enormous strain on social services. We mentioned before the free education and healthcare. Also, there's data of 120,000 kids, and 20,000 of them are enrolled in schools for now, as it's very difficult to enroll all of them, he said, overnight. It's a very short time. Those are Ukrainian children. This is a video in English, so I will play a short part of it for you.
First day in a new school. An anxious experience for any child. But especially so when you are in a foreign country because you've just had to flee your own home from war.
She was worried in order not everyone to shout to her. She's afraid of people shouting at her. Ніхто на тебе не кричав тут? But nobody shouted at her.
Хотів бути в Україні, тому що там за мною спускає тато.
Everything is alright in general in Poland, but he misses his dad.
There are 1 million Ukrainian children like Vladislav now in Poland. Getting to safe haven has been the priority, but now in the border city of Przemysl, it's getting these displaced children back in education. We went to one school where class sizes have just doubled.
It seems to me they hear their parents talking about this war, and here at school they can, here is the chance for them to forget about all this bad experience. No, that's why I think this education is very important for them.
Despite fighting a war, the Ukrainian government is also running lessons online for their children in exile. 14-year-old Christina finishes her lessons here in Poland, then logs in to keep up with the curriculum back home. So you're doing double education right now?
I need to think about my future, and I think education is a very important part of my future.
But hundreds of thousands of young Ukrainians are still
I will be wrapping up and would like to share with you a letter. In a beginning of all of this, I felt threatened as well, because Poland is threatened for my family, for my friends, because we are the closest neighbor of the invaded country. So thinking about the history of wars, the invaders move from one border to another, and what's next? There's the next country. I thought that we can do so much, and sometimes we feel so powerless, and we never know how any donations, anything goes when we reach out to the big governmental institutions or smaller ones. But now we live in the era of the internet, and we can connect with people across the globe. So there was a movement to reach out to the people who are selling things on Etsy, finding them in Ukraine. And it was just the very first week. So I bought 2 scarves from Natalia, and I told her, don't send them to me. This is only to support you financially, and please don't worry. And she was very honorable because she still wants to send them. She's like, just when I will be able to, I will send them to you. And up until now, we were sending messages, as she called them, letters. And I asked her this week, I shared with her that I am here having presentation if she would like to share anything with people in California. And this is what she wrote. Hello, Evelina. I want you to convey to all people a huge gratitude for their support. I was overwhelmed by this support. I am so grateful to everyone. In the early days, I was scared and confused. Explosions were constant. It's scary when you are at home and don't know if you will be alive tomorrow. Customer letters helped me a lot. I especially remember a letter from one of my customers. He is a musician by profession and writes music. He sent me a song that he wrote for people from Ukraine. This is magical music. When the firing started, I put on my headphones and turned it on, and I immediately felt so calm and good. I am very grateful to him and all the people who supported us. I want all people to never know what war is. May there be peace throughout the world. And you need to appreciate every peaceful day and your loved ones. It is most important. Natalia from Kiev. It's from yesterday, April 27th. In my closing slide, I will introduce you to Amelia Anisovich, who's the 7-year-old Ukrainian girl who performed Let It Go in a bomb shelter, and that video went viral. She found a refuge in Poland, and she was invited to sing the Ukrainian national anthem at the charity concert, which took place at Łódź, Poland on March 13th. And that concert raised $380,000, which was directly donated to Polish humanitarian action. In the beginning, she speaks the word koszmar, which is nightmare.
Кошмар, кошмар. Ще не вмерла України ні слава, ні воля. Ще не браття українці усміхнеться доля. Згинуть наші вороженьки, як роса на сонці запанує, і ми, браття, у своїй сторонці. Душу, тіло ми положим за нашу свободу і покажем, що ми браття козацького роду.
Thank you so much. Слава Україні!
Thank you so much, Evelina, for sharing. Yeah, a bunch of wonderful resources, and thank you for sharing from your own perspective as well. And I hope you can share some of those in our resources page too, if people want to look at them more. And I want to invite you to stay a little bit longer to hear our last speaker of this evening, who is Dustin McKenzie. He is the chair of anthropology here at Cabrillo College. So thank you.
Thanks, Kendall, for organizing this event. And thanks for all the panelists for expanding my understanding of the complexities of this issue. I'm just going to jump into it and move through this quickly. So anyway, let's see here. Growing up, I hated Russians. And the reason why is 40 years of Cold War propaganda and the media that exposed me to images of Ivan Drago and Rocky fighting and teenagers defending the homeland against a Russian-Cuban invasion. Of course, I'd never met a Russian person, never traveled to the Soviet Union, or never read Marxist philosophy, but I knew I hated them. In retrospect, when I look back, I realized I didn't actually hate. What I was experiencing was nuclear fear, and I wasn't alone. Multiple social scientists have studied the development of nuclear fear in the 1980s and its impact. And the Cold War produced high levels of fear, anxiety, and helplessness, and also the belief in nuclear annihilation led to basically nihilistic thoughts and a futurelessness. A study published in '86 found that nuclear war shaped children's views of the trustworthiness of society, and children tended to translate nuclear fear into a full-scale critique of contemporary society. Anthony Bourdain, cook, TV personality, and I think would have made one hell of an anthropologist, said, "I grew up thinking the bomb could have come at any moment, and the way my country reacted to the threat radicalized, marginalized, and alienated me in ways that are still impacting me." And I totally reflect and feel Anthony's sentiments there. If we look at kids from the 1980s, studies show that their second overall fear was the possibility of nuclear war, second only behind the death of their own parents. 58% of them worried about or were very worried about nuclear war. 50% thought that nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States was inevitable in their lifetime. Unfortunately, only 51% ever spoke to their parents about the fear they were sharing. And the image on the right is an unfortunate children's book from the 1980s. Nobody wants a nuclear war. The media played a huge role in the development of nuclear fear. We were constantly bombarded with film and TV shows that depicted the apocalypse, death rays, radioactive monsters, lone survivors such as Mad Max in these desolate apocalyptic escapes. It was a huge hook for inspiring fear amongst the youth, but it turns out it was a great way to sell products and airtime. Media representations of nuclear issues were visually dramatic, but they didn't really teach young people how to deal with the fear. And of course, depictions of nuclear war in television, video games, and music were incomplete at best. And it turns out that the way youngsters became aware of nuclear issues really contributes to their helplessness and also hopelessness within the 1980s. The list on the left shows a non-exhaustive list of TV shows and movies that depicted nuclear issues, nuclear war, nuclear destruction. War Games is one of my favorites, starring Matthew Broderick. Of course, we have Mad Max, and who could forget Maverick flipping the bird to a Russian MiG pilot in Top Gun. And I was going to show an image of the most horrific for me as a young person was The Day After, which aired in 1984 and turned out to be one of the highest rating television films in our nation's history. And I won't show you the images, but they're horrific and graphic and show people basically being vaporized due to nuclear impact sent by the Soviet Union. The music we listened to was also full of lyrical content, either direct or metaphorically, about nuclear war, nuclear destruction that caused nuclear fear. Here's a list of some popular music. And as a young punk rocker, the list on the right is what I was listening to. And I really feel that every punk rock band that was worth their salt in the late 70s and early 80s had songs about nuclear war. And the video clip I was going to show is a classic from Frankie Goes to Hollywood. It's called Two Tribes, and it shows the video shows Ronald Reagan and his Russian counterpart fighting in a Russian bear pit. The impact of this media and nuclear fear led, and this isn't my interpretation, but social science backs this up. Nuclear fear led to depression, anxiety, suicide, increased drug use, and increased promiscuity amongst youth during the late Cold War period. The promiscuity issue was only really brought to an end with the arrival of the AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s, but it also brought some positive side effects, including increased participation in social movements. Social scientists that drew comparative literature from the Soviet Union found lower levels of stress and anxiety amongst Soviet youth and greater optimism. And I don't know this for sure, but I reckon the reason why is that Soviet youth didn't have the same amount of access to popular music as youth in the United States during the same period of time. If we look at now, Google trend analysis shows that the searching for nuclear war, the phrase nuclear war has increased dramatically in the past month. A recent study of 1,000 American adults suggests that 70% of Americans and 83% of Russians are fearful of a nuclear exchange. And if you haven't seen it, there's a horrific, tragic website called Nuke Maps, in which you can drop nuclear bombs on your favorite city in the United States. And the app actually, or the website, demonstrates the amount of destruction. And the image on the right shows what would happen if one of the largest bombs in the nuclear arsenal hit Union Square in San Francisco. And you can see the peninsula, the East Bay, and Marin Headlands are completely gone, and fallout reaches Sacramento. This is trickling down to our youth. Teachers say 50% of educators say teachers need to start an open discussion, and kids are especially freaked out with headlines that include the doomsday clock, which conveys this information that the clock is 100 seconds from midnight, closest it's ever been. I've conducted my own ethnographic research since Kindle invited me to be part of this presentation. And within the anthropology department here at Cabrillo College, I have a very small sample of 68 students between the ages of 18 and 27. I asked them a bunch of scaled response questions about fear, media, and behavioral changes. And the amount of fear is spread pretty evenly across the board between low, moderate, and high levels of fear. But what's interesting is there's a direct relationship between media viewing and levels of fear, with the students reporting the highest levels of fear, also reporting the most media viewing and the most hours spent watching the news. If we move forward to changed behaviors, 43% of our student body that at least I surveyed say there's no change at all. 12% say there's significant changes. Amongst the changes that were reported include increased or decreased media viewing, sleeplessness. I've had one student suggest that they want to build a bunker, and I had a student actually tell me that her family is actively collecting iodine and protective clothing to protect them from fallout, including goggles. I don't know if that's going to be helpful or not. I've also been able to interview children and their parents between the ages of 8 and 14 years old, ask them similar questions. And what we see here is kids that are in this age bracket, 75% show no fear or anxiety at all, 25% low to moderate, and only one student reported significant levels of fear. In terms of media viewing, almost all informants reporting no fear also reported zero media or limited access to media. Behavioral changes reported from parents suggest that parents are actively restricting media access due to the current invasion, Russian invasion. 3 children that reported low to moderate fear reported negative views of Russia and Russian people. 1 reported having imagination fights with Putin, and 1 student is actually collecting money. He's a 13-year-old student at New Brighton Middle School, is actively collecting money to donate to anti-war efforts in the Ukraine. So to summarize here, nuclear fear in the Cold War was associated with anxiety and self-destructive behaviors, the othering of Russian peoples. Popular media and news outlets help propagate this nuclear fear. Existing data supports renewal of nuclear fear amongst adults in the US and in Russia. My limited ethnographic data suggests lower levels of nuclear fear within current college students and K through 12 kids in our local area. Very few changes were reported within cultural behavior. Elevated fear and cultural changes that were reported were associated with greater access to media. However, things may change as the Russian invasion advances and popular media maybe starts to use Russians as villains once again. So stay tuned as this ethnographic data comes in and changes as the war changes as well. Thanks for everyone's time.
Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you everyone for hanging out a little bit longer. We were very excited to have so much to share with you. It's such a huge topic. It's so difficult to even scrape the surface. So if you have questions, you are more than welcome to post them in the chat now, and we can respond in the resources page and send out our recording as well too. And we'll hang out a few more moments in case there's anybody who would like to stay on and discuss with us. So thank you so much. We hope that your education on this topic does not end here and now, but rather that you continue learning and you use this as either a jumping off point or newfound motivation to keep learning more and to continue in all of the ways that our presenters have suggested. So thank you all so much for your time and for sharing, and we'll stay a little bit longer in case you want to check in with any of us.